The rocking chair creaked beneath Thomas Caldwell as he sat on his porch, turning the worn gold band in his weathered fingers. 70 years had carved deep lines into his face, but his eyes remained sharp as the Arizona horizon. Beside him, a boy of 12 listened, rapt with attention, as the evening sun painted the valley gold. "Grandpa, tell me about how you met Grandma Becky," the boy asked, his eyes reflecting the same blue as Tom's own. Tom smiled, looking out over what had once been wilderness and was now the thriving town of Caldwell Springs. He slipped the ring back onto his finger, where it had remained for nearly 30 years. "It was 18, he began, his voice like aged whiskey. "The summer your grandmother Sarah was taken by the fever. The summer I learned that endings can sometimes be beginnings, if you have the courage to follow the path laid before you." As Tom's words filled the cooling evening air, the world around them seemed to shift and fade, replaced by the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the Arizona Territory 3 decades earlier. The sun above Skull Valley burned without mercy, turning the air into a shimmering curtain of heat. The desert smelled of creosote and death, a warning to those foolish enough to travel unprepared. The girl crawled through the parched weeds, her dress torn and soaked with sweat and dust. Each movement sent waves of agony through her body, emanating from where the rattlesnake had struck her hip just hours before. Rebecca Lawson, known to the few who cared as Becky, pushed forward with determination that defied her failing strength. Her right hand pressed against the wound, now a dark, angry mound of swollen flesh. The western diamondback had struck fast, its half-inch fangs delivering venom that now worked through her system. The hemotoxin was breaking down her blood cells, causing intense pain and swelling that would eventually lead to tissue death if untreated. "Don't die here, Becky," she whispered to herself, her voice cracking from thirst. "Not like this. Not because of him." The memory of Victor Holloway's face twisted in rage flashed before her. His final words as he threw her from their cabin still rang in her ears. "Get out, you cursed woman! Everything you touch turns to ruin." He had blamed her for the mine's poor yield, for the sickness of his prized horse, for every misfortune that befell him. The snake had been the final proof in his mind that she carried bad luck like a disease. Becky collapsed on the ground, the horizon spinning around her. The venom was working faster in the heat, accelerated by her exertion. She closed her eyes, feeling consciousness slipping away like water through cupped hands. Thomas Caldwell had just buried his wife 3 hours earlier. The soil over Sarah's coffin was still dark with moisture, standing out against the parched earth of the small cemetery behind the church. He had dug the grave himself with the same hands that had once built her a home, refusing help from the townspeople who had gathered to pay their respects. Sarah had been taken quickly by typhoid fever, so suddenly that Tom still expected to hear her humming by the kitchen window when he returned to their ranch. The sickness had swept through the territory that summer, claiming 3 lives in their small community. The doctor had done what he could, but medicine was scarce on the frontier, and knowledge even scarcer. Tom rode his chestnut gelding slowly along the trail that led to his ranch, his thoughts as heavy as the afternoon air. At 40, he had already lived longer than most men of his time and circumstance. He had survived the Mexican War, had built a modest but successful cattle operation, had known the joy of loving a good woman for 15 years. Now he faced the prospect of continuing alone, with only memories for company. The horse suddenly snorted and pulled at the reins, ears pricked forward. Tom's attention snapped to the present, his hand instinctively moving to the navy colt at his hip. Years of frontier life had taught him to trust his horse's senses. Following the animal's gaze, he spotted what looked like a bundle of fabric at the edge of the pine grove near Thumb Butte. As he drew closer, he realized it was a woman. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor beneath the merciless sun, her eyes half open but unfocused. For a moment, the shock of finding another soul in this desolate stretch made him wonder if grief had conjured a vision. But when he knelt beside her, the smell of venom and blood confirmed her terrible reality. She looked at him with fading consciousness, recognition of another human being briefly brightening her eyes. "That spot," she gasped, pointing weakly to her hip. "It's really swollen. Suck out the venom, please." Her voice cracked with desperation, almost gone. Tom's hands froze above her wound. He knew what the old ranchers said about snake bites, had seen men attempt the folk remedy countless times. But his time as a field medic during the war had taught him better. "That won't help now, miss," he said gently. The poison's already in your blood. Sucking only works in the first minute and spreads the poison if you've got cuts in your mouth. He carefully lifted the torn cloth to examine the wound. The bite was unmistakable. Two puncture marks about half an inch apart, surrounded by angry, swollen flesh. But what made his jaw tighten wasn't just the venom's damage. Beneath and around the bite were other marks, older bruises layered atop each other, telling a story of systematic cruelty that no rattlesnake had inflicted. She shivered when the wind touched her exposed skin. "He kicked me out," she whispered, her eyes rolling back slightly. "Said I was bad luck. Said the devil cursed me." Her words faded like smoke on the wind. Tom took off his bandana, folded it into a tight pad, and pressed it firmly against the wound. Then he lifted her into his arms, surprised at how little she weighed. The heat from her skin burned through his shirt. He couldn't tell if it was the venom or a fever. Perhaps both. He placed her carefully across his saddle before mounting behind her, one arm holding her steady against his chest as he turned the horse toward home. Every step echoed in his chest like a heartbeat that wasn't his own. For the first time since Sarah's death, something in Tom stirred. Not love, not yet, but a spark of purpose. A will to save someone when he couldn't save the one he loved. The Caldwell Ranch stood as a testament to one man's determination. Tom had built it plank by plank after returning from the Mexican War in 1848, using skills learned from his father and grandfather. The main house was solid pine, weathered to a silver gray by years of sun and wind. A wide porch wrapped around three sides, offering shade during the brutal summer months. The barn, corral, and bunkhouse formed a protective half-circle around the main structure, a practical defense against both the elements and potential threats. Inside, the house spoke of both functionality and the gentle touch of a woman's hand. Sarah's quilt still hung over the backs of chairs. Her collection of pressed wildflowers remained framed on the walls. The kitchen, with its cast-iron stove and hand pump at the sink, represented modern convenience in this remote territory. Tom carried Becky into the small bedroom that had once been intended for the children they never had. He laid her carefully on the bed, then gathered what he needed: clean water from the pump, whiskey for disinfectant, willow bark for the fever, and strips of clean linen for bandages. The experience of treating wounded soldiers during the war guided his movements. He cleaned the wound thoroughly, applied a poultice of herbs grown in Sarah's garden, and wrapped the area firmly but not too tight. Then he bathed Becky's face with cool water, coaxing her to swallow small sips of water mixed with willow bark tea. As night fell, the smell of dust and medicine mingled with the faint scent of coffee from the kitchen. Tom sat by the window, rolling his wedding ring between his fingers while staring out at the empty corral. From the small room behind him came the soft sound of labored breathing. The first night, Becky's fever raged. Tom stayed awake, replacing cool compresses on her forehead and monitoring the spread of swelling from the snake bite. By morning, he was reasonably certain she would survive the venom, though weakness and recovery would take time. It was late afternoon of the second day when she finally woke fully. Tom stepped into the room with a cup of broth and found her struggling to sit up, her eyes darting around the unfamiliar surroundings. Fear flashed across her face when she saw him. "You're safe here," he said quietly, keeping his distance. "The snake bite is looking better. You need rest." Her eyes moved over the room, taking in the plain wooden walls, the old hat hanging on a hook, the clean water in the basin beside the bed. "You live here alone?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Yes," he answered simply. "Since my wife passed." Becky lowered her gaze. "I'm sorry." Tom nodded, saying nothing more. He set the cup of broth on the bedside table and turned to leave, giving her space. "Thank you," she called after him, "for not leaving me out there." He paused in the doorway. No decent man would have. Over the next few days, as strength gradually returned to Becky's body, pieces of her story emerged. She had married Victor Holloway 3 years earlier when she was just 27. He had seemed charming then, the son of a successful merchant who had invested in a small silver mine outside of Prescott. The abuse began 6 months into their marriage, after the first disappointing yield from the mine. Tom listened without judgment, recognizing the pattern from other women he had known on the frontier. Life was hard enough without carrying the additional burden of a cruel spouse, but the law offered little protection to wives. A man's home was his castle, and what happened within those walls remained largely private business. By the 4th day, Becky could walk short distances. Tom found her on the porch one morning, watching the sunrise with a cup of coffee clutched in her hands. "It's so quiet here," she observed as he joined her, leaving a respectful distance between them. "Peaceful." "That's why we chose it," Tom replied. "Sarah and I wanted somewhere the rest of the world wouldn't bother us much." "How long were you married?" 15 years. Met her in St. Louis after I came back from Mexico, the war," he clarified. "Was working as a carpenter then. She was a school teacher." Becky nodded, sipping her coffee. "She must have been brave, coming out to this wilderness." "She was," Tom agreed, a rare smile softening his features. "Braver than me in many ways. Never complained, even when times were lean. Taught herself about plants, medicines, saved more than one life around these parts with her knowledge. Including mine," Becky noted. "Shainem, mehem," gesturing to the poultice on her hip. "These herbs, they're from her garden?" Tom nodded. She'd be glad they helped someone. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the morning calls of desert birds. In that moment, something shifted between them. Not romance, but understanding. Two people who had suffered loss, finding unexpected company in their pain. The peaceful moment was shattered 3 days later with the arrival of James Harrington, the circuit judge and an old friend of Tom's from their war days. His expression was grave as Tom met him at the gate. "This is an official visit, Tom," Harrington said, not dismounting from his horse. "Words reached Prescott that you're harboring a married woman." Tom's face remained impassive. "She was snake-bit and abandoned. Would you have me leave her to die?" Harrington sighed, removing his hat to wipe sweat from his brow. "You know that's not what I mean. Victor Holloway is claiming you kidnapped his wife. He's got connections, Tom. His father supplies half the territory." "I kidnapped no one," Tom replied evenly. "The woman was dying in the dirt when I found her. She bears marks of repeated beatings. Ask her yourself if you don't believe me." The judge glanced toward the house where Becky stood in the doorway watching them. "The law doesn't recognize beatings as grounds for a wife to leave her husband, Tom. You know that. A man has the right to discipline his household as he sees fit. And if that discipline includes leaving her to die from a snake bite?" Harrington had no immediate answer for that. He replaced his hat, shaking his head slowly. "The Holloways won't let this rest, Tom. They're already putting pressure on the sheriff. I came as a friend to warn you this could get ugly." "Wouldn't be the first time I've faced ugly," Tom said, his hand unconsciously moving to the scar that ran along his jawline, a souvenir from a Mexican bayonet. After Harrington departed, Tom found Becky waiting anxiously on the porch. "I should go," she said immediately. "I'm bringing trouble to your door." Tom shook his head. "You're not well enough yet. They'll come for me. Victor won't let this stand. His pride won't allow it." Tom looked out over his land, considering. Judge Harrington is right about the law being on their side, but sometimes what's legal and what's right aren't the same thing. He turned to face her fully. "Miss Lawson, I won't force you to stay, but I won't turn you out either. The choice is yours." Tears welled in Becky's eyes. "Why would you risk yourself for a stranger?" Tom was silent for a long moment before answering. "During the war, I saw men do terrible things. Learned that standing by while wrong is done makes you part of that wrong." He paused, then added more softly, "And Sarah would never forgive me if I turned away someone in need." The confrontation came sooner than either of them expected. Just 2 days after Judge Harrington's visit, the sound of approaching horses announced visitors. Tom had been repairing a section of fence, and he straightened slowly, watching as 3 riders approached. He recognized Victor Holloway immediately, though they had never formally met. The man rode with the arrogant posture of someone accustomed to deference. Beside him rode 2 hired men, their expressions neutral, but their posture alert. Tom wiped his hands on his trousers and walked toward the house, where Becky had been hanging laundry. Her face had drained of color at the sound of the approaching horses. "Go inside," Tom said quietly. "You don't have to face him." But Becky shook her head, squaring her shoulders despite the fear evident in her eyes. "I won't hide." Victor pulled his horse to a stop, dust billowing around the animal's legs. He was younger than Tom had expected, perhaps 35, with the soft hands and fine clothes of someone who supervised work rather than performed it. The smell of whiskey carried on the air between them. "You think you can steal what's mine, old man," Victor called out, his words slightly slurred. "A woman belongs with her husband." Tom stepped forward, placing himself between Becky and the riders. "Miss Lawson is recovering from a snake bite. She's not being held against her will." Victor laughed, a mean sound that held no humor. "Rebecca," he called, looking past Tom, Get your things. We're going home. Becky stepped forward, though she remained slightly behind Tom's protective stance. I'm not going back, Victor. Not this time. Victor's face darkened. You're my wife. The law says you go where I tell you. The law doesn't say you can beat her, Tom interjected, his voice level but firm. What happens between a man and his wife is private business, Victor snapped. She's my property, fair and square. Paid her father $100 for her hand. Tom's jaw tightened. People aren't property, Holloway. Victor swung down from his horse with surprising agility for a man in his cups. He advanced toward them, stopping when Tom shifted his stance slightly, a subtle but unmistakable warning. This is my land, Tom said quietly. My rules apply here. Victor's eyes flickered to the Colt Navy revolver on Tom's hip. The weapon was a relic from the war, but well-maintained and deadly in experienced hands. For a moment, calculation replaced anger in Victor's expression. This isn't over, he said finally, his voice dropping to a threatening growl. I'll be back with the law, old man, and they'll drag her back in chains if necessary. He turned and remounted his horse with less grace than he had dismounted. The trio rode away, Victor turning once to shout, "Nobody takes what belongs to a Holloway." When they were out of sight, Becky released a shaky breath. I told you he would come. Tom watched the dust settling on the road. And I suspect he will keep his word about returning with the law. He turned to her. We need allies. The town of Skull Creek consisted of little more than a main street with essential businesses. A general store, a blacksmith, a saloon that doubled as a hotel, and a small church. Most of the territory's commerce centered on Prescott, 15 miles to the east. But Skull Creek served the needs of the surrounding ranches and homesteads. The general store belonged to Martha Wilson, a widow who had come west with her husband in the early days of the territory, nearly 20 years earlier. At 65, she had survived Apache raids, drought, and the death of both her husband and only son. She ran her business with shrewd efficiency, and little that happened in the area escaped her notice. Tom had always respected Martha, and she was one of the few people who had truly understood his grief when Sarah died. If anyone could help them navigate the coming storm, it would be her. The bell above the store's door announced their arrival. Martha looked up from where she was measuring coffee beans, her spectacles perched on the end of her nose. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of Becky. So this is the young woman causing all the commotion, she said, setting aside her work and coming around the counter. Victor Holloway was in here yesterday, telling anyone who'd listen that you'd been kidnapped by a crazy old soldier. Becky flushed, but Tom noted that Martha's tone held no accusation, only dry observation. Mrs. Wilson, Tom began, we need advice. Martha gestured toward the back room. Come sit down. This sounds like a conversation that requires privacy and tea. The back room served as Martha's living quarters, simple but comfortable. As she prepared tea on a small stove, Tom explained the situation in his straightforward way. Becky added details about her marriage, her voice growing stronger as she spoke, as though unburdening herself gave her courage. Martha listened without interruption. When they finished, she nodded thoughtfully. The Holloways have influence, no question, she said, pouring the tea. Old Jacob Holloway supplied goods during the Mexican War and later the early conflicts with the Apache, made a fortune. His son thinks that fortune buys him whatever he wants, including the right to mistreat his wife. She turned her gaze to Becky. Show me your arm, child. Confused but compliant, Becky rolled up her sleeve, revealing a pattern of fading bruises. Martha nodded as though confirming something. My Harold raised a hand to me once, early in our marriage, only once. I told him if it happened again, he'd wake up with a knife between his ribs. She smiled grimly. He never touched me in anger again. She sipped her tea, considering. The law won't help you, Becky. Not directly. A wife is expected to obey her husband, and the courts will enforce that. But there are other ways. What do you suggest? Tom asked. First, documentation. Every mark, every injury recorded. If we can prove persistent cruelty, there might be grounds for intervention. She turned to Tom. You were a medic. Your testimony about her condition when you found her would carry weight. Who would listen? Becky asked, doubt clear in her voice. Franklin Cooper, Martha replied promptly. He's a lawyer in Prescott. Progressive thinking. Helped a woman in Flagstaff escape an abusive husband last year by finding a legal loophole. She paused. It won't be easy. It won't be quick, but it's possible. Meanwhile, Victor will try again to take her by force, Tom noted. Martha nodded. Which is why we need more allies. people who will stand witness. Make this a community concern, not just a private matter between husband and wife. For the first time, Becky looked truly hopeful. There are others in town who have seen Victor's true nature. The blacksmith's wife, Becky. She bandaged my wrist once when Victor broke it. And Michael at the saloon has seen Victor in his cups, heard his threats. Good, Martha said with satisfaction. We'll speak to them. She looked at Tom. And you need to teach this young woman to shoot. If Victor comes again, she should be able to defend herself. The idea clearly shocked Becky, but Tom nodded in agreement. Sarah could hit a tin can at 30 paces. Every woman on the frontier should know how to handle a firearm. As they prepared to leave, Martha pulled Tom aside while Becky examined a bolt of fabric. You're walking a dangerous path, Thomas Caldwell, she said quietly. The Holloways won't take this challenge lightly. Are you prepared for what might come? Tom watched Becky, noting how she still favored her injured hip, how she startled at sudden movements. He thought of Sarah, of her compassion and courage, of the vows he had made to her, to protect and cherish. He hadn't been able to protect her from disease, but perhaps in helping Becky, he could honor Sarah's memory. I've faced worse odds, he said simply. Martha studied him, then nodded. Sarah would be proud of you. After a moment, she added, come by tomorrow. I have something that might help. That night, after returning to the ranch, Tom took Becky to the barn. From a locked chest, he removed a small pistol. It was Sarah's, he explained, demonstrating how to load and cock the weapon. A Philadelphia Derringer, small enough to hide in a pocket or sleeve, but effective at close range. Becky held the pistol gingerly. I've never fired a gun before. Then it's time you learn, Tom replied. Tomorrow we'll practice with this and the rifle. Out here, self-reliance isn't just a virtue, it's a necessity. As darkness settled over the ranch, Tom completed his nightly rounds, checking the livestock and securing the buildings. From the ridge above the property, the flicker of distant lantern light caught his attention. Someone was on the road leading to his ranch, moving slowly, cautiously. Tom watched the light for several minutes, his hand resting on his revolver. The light eventually stopped, then retreated back toward town. A scout, perhaps, someone gauging the layout of the ranch, planning a return. When Tom returned to the house, he found Becky sitting by the window, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders despite the warm evening. Trouble? She asked, noting his expression. Not yet, he answered truthfully, but it's coming. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the desert. Coyotes calling in the distance, the soft hooting of an owl, the whisper of wind through pine needles. I could still leave, Becky said finally. Draw the danger away from you. Tom shook his head. And go where? Back to Victor? Into the desert alone? Neither option offers much hope. Why do you care what happens to me? She asked, the question that had been between them since the beginning. You don't even know me. Tom considered his answer carefully. In the war, I learned something important. There are those who do harm, those who stand by and watch harm being done, and those who try to stop it. I've been all three at different times. He paused. I prefer being the third kind of man. Becky studied him in the dim lamplight. Your wife was fortunate to have such a man. I was the fortunate one, Tom corrected gently. They fell silent again, each lost in private thoughts. While outside, the stars wheeled overhead in the vast Arizona sky, indifferent to the small human dramas unfolding beneath them. The battle lines were being drawn, alliances formed. The coming days would test them all. But for this moment, in this quiet house on the edge of wilderness, there was a fragile peace, a woman finding her strength, a man rediscovering his purpose, and between them, the first tentative threads of trust being woven into something that might, with time and care, become strong enough to withstand the coming storm. Morning arrived with the gentle persistence of the desert sun, painting the eastern horizon in hues of amber and gold. The Caldwell ranch awoke to life. Chickens clucked in their coop, cattle lowed softly in the pasture, and the windmill creaked as it turned in the light breeze. 1 month had passed since Becky Lawson had crawled through the dust of Skull Valley with venom coursing through her veins and fear following close behind. Tom Caldwell stood on his porch, coffee mug in hand, watching as Becky moved among the horses in the corral. She had recovered her strength more quickly than he had expected. The snake's venom had left no lasting damage, and the bruises from Victor's hands had faded to pale yellows and greens before disappearing altogether. But the wounds inside, those took longer to heal. Tom observed the change in her with quiet approval. When he'd first found her, she had been thin and frail, her eyes darting nervously at sudden movements, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman in the corral now moved with purpose, her shoulders squared, her head held high. She spoke to the horses in a confident, soothing tone that seemed to calm even the most skittish among them. Sarah's clothes fit her well enough. They'd been packed away in a cedar chest, the scent of lavender still clinging to the fabrics. Tom had offered them with awkward formality, and Becky had accepted with tearful gratitude. The simple calico dresses and sturdy boots gave her a frontier pragmatism that suited her more than the finer clothes she'd worn as Victor Holloway's wife. Becky had proven herself useful around the ranch, insisting on earning her keep. She'd taken over the kitchen garden, bringing Sarah's herbs back from the brink of neglect. She cooked meals that reminded Tom of flavors he'd almost forgotten. She mended fences, fed livestock, and learned to ride with a natural ease that suggested she'd been born to this life rather than married into wealth and privilege. In the evening light, Tom observed Becky as she worked with his horse. Her confident movements with the animals showed how far she had come since he'd found her in the desert. She handled the skittish mare with a natural patience he'd rarely seen. When she noticed his gaze and smiled, he nodded in acknowledgement, appreciating not just her help around the ranch, but the quiet strength that had begun to define her. "He's a fine horse," she called, patting the gelding's neck. "Steady, dependable." "Like his owner," Tom replied without thinking. Becky's smile widened. "Yes," she agreed simply. "Very much like his owner." The moment stretched between them, comfortable yet charged with unspoken thoughts. Then Becky returned to her task, and Tom sipped his coffee, allowing the rhythm of ranch life to settle around them like a familiar blanket. That night, Tom showed Becky how to clean and load his Henry rifle, a veteran of the Mexican War like himself. She listened intently as he explained the mechanics, her fingers nimble as she practiced loading and unloading the weapon. "Never point at anything you don't intend to shoot," Tom instructed, "and know what's behind your target. A bullet that misses can travel a long way." Becky nodded, absorbing his teachings with the same quiet determination she brought to all mom tasks. "When I was a girl, my father wanted a son," she said suddenly. "He never taught me these things, said they weren't for women to know." "Your father was wrong," Tom said firmly. "Out here, practical knowledge keeps you alive, man or woman." The next morning, they rode to a secluded spot behind the ranch, where Tom had set up tin cans along a fallen log. For an hour, he coached Becky through the basics of marksmanship: stance, breathing, sight alignment. Her first shots went wild, the rifle's recoil surprising her. But by the 10th shot, she was hitting more than missing. "Not bad," Tom acknowledged, the highest praise he typically offered. "With practice, you'll improve." The small Philadelphia Derringer proved easier for her to handle. Its limited range meant accuracy was less critical, but its small size made it ideal for concealment. "Keep it with you," Tom advised. "Always. If Victor returns with men, a visible rifle might escalate things. But having this hidden gives you a final option if all else fails." The gravity of the situation settled over them. This wasn't merely target practice. It was preparation for a confrontation they both knew was coming. Their routine established itself with the natural flow of necessity. Mornings began with chores: feeding animals, repairing equipment, tending gardens. Afternoons often found them working together on larger projects, mending the barn roof, reinforcing fences, or riding the property boundaries to check for strays. Evenings were for quiet conversation on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast Arizona sky. It was during these evening talks that Becky learned about Tom's past, how he'd grown up in Tennessee, the son of a carpenter who taught him to work with his hands, how he joined the Army at 20, seeking adventure and finding instead the horrors of war, how he'd met Sarah in St. Louis while recovering from wounds received at the Battle of Monterey, how they traveled west together, seeking land and a fresh start. In turn, Becky shared her own history, her childhood in Boston, her father a successful merchant who lost everything in a market crash, her mother's death from consumption, the desperate marriage to Victor, arranged by her father to secure his own comfortable retirement before he too passed on. Victor wasn't always cruel, she admitted one evening. The first 6 months were pleasant enough. He was attentive, even kind. But then the mine yielded less silver than expected. His father threatened to cut him off if he couldn't make it profitable. She stared into the darkness beyond the porch. "The first time he hit me, he apologized immediately. Brought me flowers the next day. Swore it would never happen again." A bitter smile crossed her face. "That's how it always begins, I suppose. with promises never meant to be kept. Tom listened silently. He'd known men like Victor during the war, men who could charm their superiors while tormenting those under their command, men who needed to dominate others to feel powerful themselves. "You deserve better," he said finally. The simple statement hung in the air between them, weighted with truth. Becky turned to look at him, her eyes glistening in the lantern light. "Perhaps, but the law doesn't concern itself with what women deserve, only with what men possess." The words were spoken without self-pity, merely as acknowledgement of the world they inhabited. Tom had no argument against this reality. Instead, he made a silent promise to himself and to Sarah's memory that he would do whatever necessary to give Becky a chance at the freedom and dignity every human deserved. The confrontation they had been preparing for arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Tom was in the barn, repairing a saddle, when he heard the sound of multiple horses approaching. He set down his tools and stepped outside, squinting against the bright sunlight. A cloud of dust marked the approach of riders from the direction of town. "Becky," he called, his voice calm but carrying. "Company coming." She emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face paled at the sight of the dust cloud, but she moved with purpose to Tom's side. Her hand brushed against the pocket of her dress, where he knew the derringer rested. As the riders drew closer, Tom recognized Deputy Sheriff Tucker leading the group. Behind him rode Victor Holloway, and behind them 4 more men Tom didn't recognize. All were armed, pistols on their hips, rifles in their saddle scabbards. "Stay calm," Tom murmured to Becky. "Let me do the talking." The riders pulled up in the yard, spreading out in a semicircle that felt more like a military maneuver than a social call. Tucker dismounted first, adjusting his badge importantly on his chest. He was a young man, not much older than 30, with a thin mustache and the swaggering confidence of someone who enjoyed authority without having earned it. "Thomas Caldwell," Tucker announced formally. "I have business with you today." Tom nodded slightly. "Deputy, what brings you and your associates to my property?" Tucker glanced back at Victor, who remained mounted, a satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I've received a complaint that you're harboring a married woman against her will and against the express wishes of her lawful husband." Tucker's voice carried the rehearsed quality of memorized legal language. "Miss Lawson is here of her own free will," Tom replied evenly, "and I believe she can speak for herself on the matter." Tucker's eyes flickered to Becky, then back to Tom. "The law is clear on this, Caldwell. A wife belongs with her husband. Her wishes don't enter into it." "I was left to die in the desert," Becky interjected, her voice stronger than Tom had expected. "Abandoned after a snake bite. Mr. Caldwell saved my life and has offered me sanctuary while I recover." Victor spoke for the first time, his voice dripping with a false concern. "My dear, you were clearly not in your right mind. Running off into the wilderness like that after our little disagreement. I've been sick with worry." Tom felt Becky stiffen beside him. The blatant lie hung in the air like carrion stench. "Deputy," Tom said carefully, "this woman bears the marks of repeated physical abuse. Any doctor would confirm it. Is the law truly on the side of a man who beats his wife and leaves her to die?" Tucker shifted uncomfortably, but Victor cut in before he could respond. "What happens between a man and his wife is private business, Caldwell. The law doesn't concern itself with how I discipline my household." Victor's voice hardened. "Rebecca, this has gone on long enough. You're coming home now." "I'm not going anywhere with you, Victor," Becky replied, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. Tucker sighed as though dealing with troublesome children. "Ma'am, I have a legal obligation to return you to your husband. If you resist, I'll have no choice but to place you under arrest." "On what charge?" Tom challenged. "Abandonment of marital duties," Tucker replied promptly. "It's in the territorial statutes. Now we can do this peacefully, or—" He left the threat unfinished, but the meaning was clear as his hand rested on the pistol at his hip. Tom assessed the situation with the cool calculation of a veteran. 6 armed men against 1. Even with Becky armed, the odds were prohibitively poor. Violence now would only end in bloodshed, most likely his own, leaving Becky unprotected. "There's another option," came a new voice from the road. All heads turned to see Martha Wilson approaching in her small wagon, accompanied by a man Tom didn't recognize. The newcomer was perhaps 50, dressed in the dark suit and string tie of a city professional, clearly out of place in the dusty ranch yard. Tucker frowned. "This doesn't concern you, Mrs. Wilson." Martha pulled her wagon to a stop and fixed the deputy with a steely gaze. "When the law is being misused to perpetuate cruelty, It concerns every decent person in this territory. She gestured to her companion. This is Franklin Cooper, attorney at law from Prescott. He'd like to discuss certain legal matters with you, Deputy. Cooper stepped forward, his manner calm but authoritative. Deputy Tucker, I must point out that the statute you referenced requires evidence of willful abandonment. Given Mrs. Holloway's testimony that she was expelled from her home while injured, and the visible evidence of prior abuse, this case requires judicial review before any action can be taken. Tucker blinked, clearly unprepared for legal opposition. I have orders. From whom? Cooper interrupted. Sheriff Wilson? I doubt it, as he's currently meeting with Judge Harrington regarding this very matter. Or perhaps your orders come more directly from Mr. Holloway here, or his father. The implication of corruption hung in the air. Tucker's face reddened, and he glanced uncertainly at Victor, whose expression had darkened dangerously. This is absurd, Victor snapped. She's my wife. The law gives me authority over her. The law also has provisions against cruelty, Mr. Holloway, Cooper replied mildly. Provisions I intend to explore fully in court. Tucker looked increasingly uncomfortable, caught between Victor's demands and the unexpected legal challenge. Cooper pressed his advantage. I suggest, Deputy, that you return to town and consult with the sheriff before proceeding. I've filed preliminary papers for a hearing on this matter. Any attempt to remove Mrs. Holloway forcibly before that hearing could be construed as interference with due process. The standoff stretched for several tense moments. Tom remained perfectly still, aware that any sudden movement could trigger violence from the increasingly frustrated Victor or his hired men. Beside him, Becky stood straight, her face composed despite the fear he knew she must be feeling. Finally, Tucker removed his hand from his pistol and adjusted his hat. I'll need to consult with the sheriff, he conceded reluctantly. But this isn't over, Caldwell. The law's still the law. Indeed it is, Cooper agreed pleasantly. All of it, not just the parts convenient to certain interests. Victor's face contorted with rage. This is ridiculous. I won't be denied what's mine by some city lawyer with clever words. He turned his glare on Becky. You'll regret this defiance, Rebecca. No one humiliates a Holloway without consequences. With that final threat, he wheeled his horse around and spurred it perhaps harder than necessary. Tucker and the other men followed, though the deputy cast a backwards glance that suggested this retreat was merely temporary. When they were gone, Tom released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Your timing is impeccable, Martha. The older woman smiled grimly as she climbed down from her wagon. When I heard Tucker assembling a posse, I knew we had to act quickly. Fortunately, Mr. Cooper was already in town on other business. Cooper approached, extending his hand to Tom. Franklin Cooper, Mr. Caldwell. Mrs. Wilson has told me about your situation. I believe I can help, though I must warn you that legal remedies in these matters are neither simple nor swift. Tom shook the man's hand, finding his grip surprisingly strong for a city lawyer. We appreciate any help you can offer, Mr. Cooper. Please come inside. It seems we have much to discuss. As they walked toward the house, Martha fell into step beside Becky, placing a supportive arm around the younger woman's shoulders. You did well, standing your ground like that. Becky's composure finally cracked, tears welling in her eyes. They'll be back, won't they? Martha nodded soberly. Yes, child, but next time we'll be better prepared. Inside, seated around the kitchen table with coffee provided by Becky, Cooper outlined their legal position. The news was not encouraging. The territorial laws regarding marriage are heavily weighted in favor of husbands, he explained. A wife is considered the legal property of her husband, with few rights of her own. Divorce is possible, but only under specific circumstances, and requires substantial evidence and judicial sympathy, both of which are in short supply. So the law offers no protection, Tom said flatly. Cooper held up a finger. I said it was difficult, not impossible. There are 3 potential avenues we might pursue. He ticked them off on his fingers. First, we can document a pattern of extreme cruelty that goes beyond what the courts consider reasonable discipline. Second, we can prove abandonment with intent to cause harm. And third, we can demonstrate that Mr. Holloway is morally unfit through evidence of other criminal behavior. Becky looked up sharply. Victor gambles, heavily, and I've seen him pay debts with silver ore taken directly from the mine, bypassing his father's accounting. Cooper nodded thoughtfully. Theft from the family business could be useful, especially if it involves defrauding investors. Do you have any proof of this? I kept a journal, Becky said. It's still at the cabin, hidden beneath a floorboard under the bed. It details everything. The beatings, the gambling, the stolen ore. That journal could be crucial evidence, Cooper said, but retrieving it would be dangerous. I could go, Martha suggested. As a woman calling on another woman, it wouldn't raise suspicions. Tom shook his head. Victor knows you're ally with us now. He'd never allow you near the cabin. I have to go back, Becky said quietly. 3 pairs of eyes turned to her in surprise. Absolutely not, Tom said immediately. It's too dangerous, Martha agreed. But Cooper was studying Becky with newfound respect. You're suggesting a strategic return, he said slowly, appearing to reconcile while gathering evidence. Becky nodded. Victor's pride would be satisfied if he thought I'd come crawling back. He'd believe he'd won. It would give me time to collect the journal and possibly gather more evidence. It's too risky, Tom insisted. You've seen what he's capable of. If he suspected your intentions, it's my life at stake, Becky interrupted, a firmness in her voice that brooked no argument. My future, my freedom. I should have a say in how we fight for it. Silence fell around the table. Tom wanted to object further, but he recognized the determination in Becky's eyes. It was the same determination he'd seen in Sarah when she'd insisted on coming west, despite the dangers. The same determination he had felt himself when joining the army against his father's wishes. If we pursue this strategy, Cooper said carefully, we would need to establish certain safeguards. Regular check-ins, a signal system if you are in danger, and a clear timeline. I wouldn't want you in that environment any longer than absolutely necessary. Martha nodded slowly. I could visit regularly, bringing supplies. Victor might not welcome me, but he couldn't refuse a neighbor's courtesy without raising eyebrows. Becky turned to Tom, clearly seeking his support despite her declaration of independence. It might be our only chance, she said softly. The journal alone could make the difference between freedom and a lifetime of abuse. Tom's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. The soldier in him wanted to storm Holloway's cabin, gun drawn. The rancher in him wanted to bar the doors, keep Becky safely at the ranch. But the man in him, the one who'd learned about respect through loving Sarah, recognized that Becky's choice must be honored, no matter how it tore at him. 3 days, he said finally. You get what you need and get out. At the first sign of danger, you leave immediately. Martha checks on you daily, and you take the Derringer. Relief flooded Becky's face. Thank you for understanding. Cooper cleared his throat. There's something else we should discuss. The Holloways are powerful in this territory. Taking legal action against them won't just be difficult, it could be dangerous for all involved. He looked directly at Tom. Are you prepared for the potential consequences, Mr. Caldwell? Not just legal harassment, but possibly economic retaliation, social isolation, even physical threats? Tom met the lawyer's gaze steadily. Mr. Cooper, I've survived a war, built this ranch from nothing, and buried the love of my life. I'm not easily intimidated. Cooper nodded, apparently satisfied. Very well, we should begin preparations immediately. The longer Mrs. Holloway remains here, the more likely another confrontation becomes. They spent the remainder of the afternoon crafting their strategy. Cooper would file legal papers requesting a hearing on the matter of extreme cruelty, creating a legitimate legal process that Deputy Tucker and the Holloways would find harder to circumvent. Meanwhile, Becky would appear to reconcile with Victor, using the legal pressure as her excuse for returning. Tell him you're afraid of the scandal, Martha suggested. Men like Victor care deeply about their public image. Appeal to that vanity. As Cooper and Martha prepared to leave, the lawyer took Tom aside. There's something else you should know, he said quietly. Jacob Holloway, Victor's father, has significant mining interests throughout the territory. He's been buying water rights wherever possible. Tom frowned. What does that have to do with our situation? Your ranch sits on a crucial watershed. The stream that runs through your property feeds several smaller ranches downstream, as well as providing water for parts of Skull Creek. Understanding dawned. You think this is about more than just Victor's pride. They want my land. Cooper nodded grimly. Control of water is power in Arizona territory, Mr. Caldwell. Jacob Holloway understands that better than most. Your defiance of his son gives him a convenient excuse to target you, but I suspect he's had his eye on this property for some time. The revelation cast the conflict in a new light. Tom had assumed they were facing merely the wounded pride of an abusive husband. Now he realized they were potentially challenging one of the most powerful economic interests in the territory. After their visitors departed, Tom found Becky on the porch, staring out at the lengthening shadows as evening approached. She looked small and vulnerable, despite the strength she'd shown during the confrontation. You don't have to do this, he said, joining her at the railing. We could find another way. Becky shook her head. This is the surest path to freedom. I've spent 3 years living in fear of Victor's moods, his fists. I won't spend the rest of my life that way. She turned to face Tom. You've shown me what it means to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. I can do no less. Tom studied her face in the fading light, seeing not just beauty there, but courage and determination that humbled him. Sarah would have liked you, he said suddenly. A small smile touched Becky's lips. I wish I could have known her. She always said true strength isn't about never feeling fear. It's about feeling afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. Becky nodded. Then I hope to be truly strong tomorrow. That night, neither of them slept well. Tom sat in the rocking chair on the porch long after Becky had retired to her room, turning over Cooper's revelations about Jacob Holloway's water interests. If the lawyer was right, they weren't just fighting for Becky's freedom, but potentially for the survival of the ranch itself. Morning arrived with uncomfortable swiftness. Becky emerged from her room dressed in the clothes she'd worn when Tom found her, now cleaned and mended. The transformation was striking and disturbing. Gone was the confident woman who had flourished at the ranch. In her place stood the submissive wife Victor expected, eyes downcast, shoulders slightly hunched. How do I look? She asked, attempting a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Like you're going to a funeral, Tom answered honestly. Perhaps I am. The death of one life, the birth of another. She straightened slightly. When this is over, I'll never pretend to be less than I am again. Tom nodded, unable to find adequate words. Instead, he handed her a small leather pouch. What's this? Emergency money, $20 in gold, enough to get you to Prescott or Tucson if things go wrong. Keep it hidden. Becky accepted the pouch, tucking it into her bodice. I'll repay you. No need. Consider it an investment in justice. The ride to town was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. The plan was simple. Tom would accompany Becky to Skull Creek, where she would publicly declare her intention to return to Victor. Cooper would be present as a witness, establishing the voluntary nature of her return to prevent later accusations that Tom had kidnapped her. The town was unusually busy when they arrived, wagons and horses lining the main street. Tom recognized several faces from surrounding ranches and homesteads. Word of the confrontation had clearly spread. Cooper was waiting outside the general store, his expression grave. Victor is at the saloon, he informed them. He's been there since yesterday afternoon, drinking heavily and telling anyone who'll listen about his plans for when he gets his wife back. Tom's jaw tightened. Maybe this isn't such a good idea after all. It's still our best option, Becky said firmly. If he's been drinking, he'll be even more likely to believe I've come crawling back. They made their way toward the saloon, attracting curious glances from townspeople. Tom was acutely aware of the weight of his revolver at his hip and of the small bulge in Becky's pocket where the Derringer rested. Victor emerged from the saloon before they reached it, as if alerted to their presence. He stood on the boardwalk, swaying slightly, his face flushed with alcohol and anger. Behind him loomed two men Tom recognized from the previous day's confrontation. Well, well, Victor called, his voice carrying in the sudden hush that fell over the street. Look who's decided to remember her proper place. Becky stepped forward, her performance beginning. Victor, please, could we speak privately? Victor laughed harshly. Why privately? Let everyone hear how you abandoned your husband and shamed the Holloway name. He gestured expansively to the gathering crowd. Cooper intervened smoothly. Mr. Holloway, your wife is attempting to reconcile despite the unpleasantness of recent events. Perhaps you could show equal good faith by discussing matters civilly. Victor's bloodshot eyes narrowed as they focused on Cooper. You, the interfering lawyer. His gaze shifted to Tom. And you, the kidnapper who thinks he can challenge a Holloway in his own territory. No one kidnapped anyone, Tom said evenly. Miss Lawson is here of her own free will, just as she's choosing to return to you now despite my reservations. Victor sneered. Your reservations? Who are you to have any say in the matter? He stepped closer, alcohol emboldening him. She's my wife, mine to do with as I please. Victor, Becky interjected, placing a restraining hand on his arm. Please, you're making a scene. I just want to come home. For a moment, Victor seemed mollified by her submissive tone. Then his expression hardened again. Not until he admits it, he said, jerking his head toward Tom. Not until he admits he took what belongs to me. Tom remained silent, unwilling to provide the false confession Victor wanted. Say it, Victor demanded, his voice rising. Say you stole my wife. That's enough, Holloway, came a new voice. Sheriff Wilson, a stocky man in his 50s with a gray-streaked beard, pushed through the crowd. "You're disturbing the peace." Victor turned his belligerence toward the new arrival. "I'm disturbing the peace? This man stole my property, and you're worried about a little noise." The sheriff sighed heavily. "Mrs. Holloway isn't property, no matter what the law says about a husband's rights. Now, are you going to accept your wife's return peacefully, or do I need to lock you up until you sober up?" A tense silence followed. Tom could almost see the calculations happening behind Victor's bloodshot eyes. Finally, self-interest won out over pride. "Fine," Victor spat. "Come along, Rebecca. We're going home." He grabbed Becky's arm roughly, pulling her toward where his horse was tethered. Tom stepped forward instinctively, but Cooper's hand on his shoulder restrained him. "Don't," the lawyer murmured. "It will only make things worse for her." Forced to watch helplessly, Tom saw Becky mount behind Victor on his horse. As they prepared to ride away, she looked back once, her eyes meeting Tom's with a mixture of fear and resolve. Then they were gone, dust rising behind Victor's horse as he rode out of town, taking Becky back to the cabin where her nightmare had begun. "We've done all we can for now," Cooper said quietly. "The legal proceedings are in motion. Sheriff Wilson is aware of the situation. Martha will check on her tomorrow." Tom nodded mechanically, already wondering if they'd made a terrible mistake. The sight of Victor's rough handling, the flash of fear in Becky's eyes, the crowd's uncomfortable silence, all of it spoke to the precariousness of their plan. "What if he hurts her again?" Tom asked, voicing his deepest fear. "She has the pistol," Cooper reminded him. "And she's stronger now, more prepared. You've given her that much, at least." The words offered little comfort as Tom mounted his own horse for the solitary ride back to the ranch. The house felt empty without Becky's presence. He moved through the evening chores automatically, his mind 15 miles away at the Holloway cabin, imagining what might be happening there. That night, Tom slept fitfully, haunted by dreams of Sarah and Becky, their faces blending together in his subconscious. Both women he had failed to protect adequately, both facing dangers he couldn't shield them from. He awoke before dawn, drenched in sweat despite the cool night air. Making his decision, he dressed quickly and saddled his horse while stars still dotted the sky. He would ride to the edge of Holloway's property, close enough to intervene if necessary, but not so close as to be discovered. He couldn't sit idle at the ranch, not knowing if Becky was safe. The eastern horizon was just beginning to lighten when Tom reached the ridge overlooking Holloway's cabin. From his vantage point among a stand of pine trees, he could observe without being seen. Smoke rose from the cabin's chimney, suggesting someone was awake. A single horse, Victor's, stood in the small corral beside the structure. As the sun climbed higher, Tom watched the cabin for signs of life. Victor emerged once, stumbling slightly as he made his way to the outhouse, then returned inside. Of Becky, there was no sign. By mid-morning, Tom's concern had deepened to alarm. There had been no screams, no sounds of violence, but the continued absence of any sign of Becky troubled him. Had Victor locked her away? Was she injured, unable to move about? His fears were interrupted by the sound of an approaching wagon. Martha Wilson appeared on the road below, her small cart loaded with what appeared to be supplies. As arranged, she was making her check-in under the guise of neighborly assistance. Tom watched as Martha pulled up to the cabin. Victor emerged, clearly unhappy at the interruption. Though too distant to hear their exchange, Tom could read the body language. Victor's aggressive stance, Martha's determined persistence. Finally, Victor threw up his hands and stalked off toward a small shed behind the cabin, leaving Martha to enter alone. She remained inside for perhaps 20 minutes. When she emerged, her expression was carefully neutral as she climbed back into her wagon. Victor watched her departure from the porch, arms crossed over his chest. Tom waited until Martha was well away from the cabin before circling around to intercept her on the road back to town. She showed no surprise at his appearance, merely pulling her wagon to a stop as he approached. "I thought I might find you out here," she said by way of greeting, keeping watch like a guardian angel. "How is she?" Tom asked without preamble. Martha's expression softened. "Physically unharmed for now. Victor was too drunk last night to do much besides pass out. This morning he's nursing a terrible headache, which is keeping his temper in check temporarily." Relief flooded through Tom. "And the journal, has she found it?" "Still there, hidden exactly where she left it. She'll retrieve it tonight when Victor goes into town. Apparently he has a standing card game at the saloon every Wednesday evening." "Then what? How does she get away?" She'll slip out after he leaves, make her way to the creek that runs behind the property, follow it downstream to avoid leaving tracks. I'll be waiting with the wagon about a mile south where the creek crosses the Prescott Road. Tom nodded, the plan sounding reasonable enough. I'll be watching too, just in case. Martha studied him with knowing eyes. You care for her, more than just as someone needing protection. It wasn't a question, and Tom didn't treat it as one. Doesn't matter what I feel. She deserves her freedom, regardless. True enough, Martha agreed. But when this is over, when she is free, perhaps it might matter then. Tom had no answer for that. His feelings for Becky were complicated, tangled up with grief for Sarah and guilt over his failure to protect either woman adequately. Even if Becky secured her legal freedom, would she want to remain in Arizona territory, with all its painful memories? And what could he offer her besides a hardscrabble existence on an aging ranch? One problem at a time, he said finally. First, we get her safely away with that journal. Martha nodded. Tomorrow, God willing. Now, I should continue on before my absence raises suspicions. Victor thinks I'm heading to the Jenkins place after this. As Martha's wagon disappeared around a bend in the road, Tom retreated to his observation point on the ridge. He would remain until nightfall, watching over the cabin from a distance, unable to intervene directly but unwilling to abandon his vigil. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Victor emerged occasionally, chopping wood at one point, checking his horse at another. Each time Tom tensed, watching for any sign of Becky, any indication of trouble. But the cabin remained quiet, offering no clues as to what transpired within its walls. As evening approached, Victor saddled his horse and rode toward town, just as Martha had predicted. Tom waited, counting the minutes, expecting Becky to emerge shortly after. But an hour passed, then another, with no sign of movement from the cabin. Concern grew into alarm. Oh, my arm. Had something gone wrong? Was Becky injured, unable to make her escape? Or had Victor suspected their plan and set a trap, pretending to leave while actually lying in wait? Just as Tom had decided he would need to approach the cabin himself, the door finally opened. Becky emerged cautiously, glancing around before slipping around to the back of the structure. Tom lost sight of her momentarily, then caught glimpse of movement as she made her way toward the creek, keeping to the shadows. Relief washed over him. The plan was proceeding, delayed but still in motion. Tom mounted his horse and began making his way carefully down from the ridge, intending to parallel Becky's path at a distance, providing unseen protection as she made her way to the rendezvous point with Martha. He had just reached the base of the hill when the sound of approaching horses froze him in place. Multiple riders moving fast from the direction of town. Tom urged his mount into the cover of a pine grove, watching as 5 horsemen galloped past on the road, heading toward Holloway's cabin. Even in the dim twilight, Tom recognized Victor at the lead, his face contorted with rage. Someone had betrayed their plan. Or perhaps Victor had simply grown suspicious and returned early to check on his wife. Either way, Becky was now in grave danger, caught between the cabin and the rendezvous point, with Victor and his men closing in behind her. Tom spurred his horse into motion, no longer concerned with remaining hidden. All that mattered now was reaching Becky before Victor did. The coming confrontation would determine not just her fate, but the course of all their lives in the harsh frontier justice of Arizona territory. The Arizona night closed around Tom Caldwell like a fist as he urged his horse through the sparse pine forest. Above him, stars punctured the velvet darkness, indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath their ancient light. The creek gurgled somewhere to his right, a silver thread in the moonlight, Becky's planned escape route, now a path of terrible vulnerability. Tom knew these woods better than most. Years of hunting and tracking cattle had etched the terrain into his mind, allowing him to move confidently even in darkness. He estimated Becky had perhaps 15 minutes head start on Victor and his men, not enough if she kept to the creek as planned. Pulling his mount to a halt, Tom listened. From the direction of Holloway's cabin, men's voices carried on the still air, angry shouts, orders being given, the sound of hooves, multiple horses moving out. The hunt had begun. Tom made a quick decision. Becky would be following the creek southward toward the Prescott Road where Martha waited. Victor would expect this and would send men in that direction. But there was another way, a deer trail that cut east through rocky terrain before rejoining the road 2 miles further south. If Tom could reach Becky before Victor's men, they might escape using that route. He spurred his horse into motion again, cutting away from the main path and navigating by memory and moonlight. The gelding responded to his urgency, picking its way sure-footedly through the darkness. Minutes stretched like hours as Tom pushed forward, straining his ears for any sound of Becky or her pursuers. Then he heard it, a cry quickly muffled, coming from a small clearing ahead. Tom drew his revolver and dismounted, approaching on foot. Through the trees, he could make out three figures. Becky, backed against a boulder, her small Derringer pointed unsteadily at two men who advanced toward her with the casual confidence of predators who know their prey is cornered. "Come now, Mrs. Holloway," one of the men said, his voice carrying clearly. "Mr. Holloway just wants what's his. No need for anyone to get hurt." "Stay back," Becky warned, her voice remarkably steady despite her situation. "I will use this." The men exchanged glances, clearly doubting her resolve. One of them took a step closer. "That little pistol only has one shot, ma'am, and there's two of us." Tom moved silently into position, years of wartime experience guiding his steps. When he spoke, both men froze. "Actually, gentlemen, there's 3 guns now, and mine has 5 shot." The men turned slowly, finding themselves looking down the barrel of Tom's Colt Navy. In the moonlight, their features sharpened into recognition, the same hired hands who had accompanied Victor and Deputy Tucker to the ranch. "This isn't your business, Caldwell," the taller one said, though his hand remained carefully away from his own weapon. "When you threaten a woman under my protection, it becomes my business," Tom replied evenly. "Now you have 2 choices. Ride away and tell Victor you never found her, or find out if your employer's money is worth dying for." The 2 men exchanged glances, a silent calculation passing between them. Mercenary loyalty only extended so far. Without another word, they backed toward their horses. "Mr. Holloway won't forget this," the shorter one warned as he mounted. "Neither will I," Tom answered coldly. They rode off into the darkness, but Tom harbored no illusions about their retreat. They would return to Victor, who would then bring more men. They had minutes, not hours. Becky lowered the Derringer, her hand trembling now that the immediate danger had passed. "I thought," she began, then stopped, unable to put her fear into words. "I know," Tom said simply. He holstered his revolver and moved to her side. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "No, but they were waiting along the creek, as if they knew I would come this way." "Victor must have suspected," Tom said grimly. "Did you get the journal?" Becky patted the small bundle tucked into her dress. "Yes, everything's here. 3 years of records." "Good. We need to move quickly. Martha's waiting, but we can't take the planned route now." He helped her onto his horse, then mounted behind her. "There's another way, rougher but safer." As they set off along the deer trail, Tom felt Becky lean back against him, drawing strength from his presence. The small gesture of trust stirred something in his chest, a protective instinct that went beyond duty or obligation. "I was so afraid," she admitted quietly as they rode. "Not just of being caught, but of failing, of spending the rest of my life under Victor's control." "That won't happen," Tom promised, the words emerging before he could consider their weight. "Not while I'm breathing." They rode in silence after that, picking their way carefully through the rocky terrain. The path narrowed in places, forcing them to dismount and lead the horse. All the while, Tom remained alert for sounds of pursuit, but the night remained eerily quiet. After nearly an hour of difficult travel, they emerged onto the Prescott Road about a mile south of the planned rendezvous point. Tom reined in, listening. From the north came the distant sound of horses, multiple riders moving at speed. "Victor," Becky whispered, her body tensing. Tom nodded grimly. "With reinforcements. They'll have figured out we're headed for the road." "What about Martha? She's waiting for us." Tom considered their options quickly. "She'll be at the creek crossing. That's still north of us. Victor will pass her on his way south." "We can't leave her," Becky insisted. "We won't," Tom assured her, "but we need to get you to safety first." The decision was made for them as a wagon appeared around the bend ahead, moving steadily toward them. Tom reached for his revolver, then relaxed as he recognized Martha's sturdy bay horse and the familiar outline of her small cart. Martha pulled up alongside them, her face lined with worry in the moonlight. "Thank the Lord," she breathed. "When you didn't arrive, I feared the worst." "Victor returned early," Tom explained. "Set men watching the creek. We had to take another route." Martha nodded briskly, absorbing the information. "He and his men passed me not 10 minutes ago, heading south. I pulled off the road until they were gone. They were moving fast, didn't even notice an old woman's wagon in the shadows." "We need to get to Prescott," Tom said. "Tonight, Cooper needs the journal, and Becky needs to be somewhere Victor can't reach her easily." "Climb in, child," Martha said to Becky. We'll make better time with the wagon on the main road than trying to cut across country again. As Becky transferred to the wagon, Tom remained mounted. I'll ride behind as rear guard, he explained. If Victor and his men double back, I can hold them off while you get away. Becky caught his arm. Tom, no. Come with us. Please. He covered her hand with his own, squeezing gently. I'll be right behind you, but someone needs to watch your backs. Before she could object further, Tom backed his horse away from the wagon. Get her to Cooper's office in Prescott. I'll meet you there by morning. Martha nodded, understanding the necessity. She flicked the reins and the wagon lurched forward, carrying Becky toward the safety of the territorial capital 15 miles away. Tom watched until they disappeared around the next bend, then positioned himself where he could observe the road in both directions. Victor and his men had passed recently, heading south, but they would eventually realize their quarry had eluded them and double back. When that happened, Tom intended to delay them by any means necessary. The night deepened. An owl called from nearby, its mournful cry echoing across the silent landscape. Tom dismounted, allowing his horse to rest while he maintained his vigil. His thoughts turned to Becky, her courage in returning to face Victor, her determination to free herself from his control. Few men Tom had known possessed such strength of will, and fewer still had stirred his heart the way she had. Tom pushed the thought aside. Even if Becky secured her freedom from Victor legally, there was no guarantee she would choose to remain in Arizona territory. Why would she, with its harsh landscapes and painful memories? And what could he offer her beyond a struggling ranch and a heart still partially claimed by Sarah's memory? His reflections were interrupted by the distant sound of approaching riders. Tom mounted quickly, positioning himself behind a large pine that offered both concealment and a clear view of the road. Minutes later, Victor Holloway and 4 riders appeared, moving more slowly now, their initial haste giving way to frustration as their search proved fruitless. Tom remained perfectly still as they passed his position. Victor's voice carried clearly in the night air, his words slurred with both alcohol and rage. She can't have disappeared. Search every inch of this road. I want her found tonight. One of the men, whom Tom recognized as the taller of the two who had confronted Becky at the creek, spoke hesitantly. Mr. Holloway, she's likely reached Prescott by now. Maybe we should return in the morning with— I don't pay you to think, Victor snapped. I pay you to obey. Find her, or don't bother coming back to collect your wages. The small party continued down the road, soon swallowed by darkness. Tom waited several minutes to ensure they were truly gone, then urged his horse onto the road, heading north toward Prescott. He would circle wide around Victor's men, avoiding the main road where possible. The journey would take longer, but the risk of confrontation was too great otherwise. As he rode through the starlit night, Tom found himself praying for the first time since Sarah's death. Not formal words, but a simple, desperate plea that Becky would reach safety, that the journal would provide the evidence needed, that somehow against the odds, justice might prevail. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when Tom reached Prescott. The territorial capital was larger than Skull Creek, boasting several proper streets, a courthouse, and even a small hotel. Cooper's office occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building on the town's main street, with his living quarters above. Tom approached cautiously, alert for any sign of Victor or his men, but the street remained quiet in the pre-dawn hours. A light burned in the window of Cooper's office, suggesting someone was awake despite the early hour. He tied his horse at the hitching post and knocked softly. The door opened almost immediately, revealing Martha's weathered face, tight with worry, that eased at the sight of him. Thank goodness, she said, pulling him inside. We were beginning to fear the worst. The office was small but well appointed, with a solid desk, several chairs, and bookshelves lined with leather-bound legal volumes. Cooper sat behind the desk, his spectacles perched on his nose as he examined papers spread before him. Becky occupied a chair near the window, her face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes brightening as Tom entered. You made it, she said, relief evident in her voice. Took the long way around, Tom explained, removing his hat. Victor and his men were searching the road. Any trouble on your journey? Martha shook her head. None. We arrived just after midnight. Mr. Cooper was kind enough to receive us despite the hour. Cooper looked up from the papers, which Tom now recognized as pages from Becky's journal. This evidence is more compelling than I had dared hope, Mayor Caldwell. Mrs. Holloway has documented not only the abuse, but also significant financial improprieties that will be of great interest to Jacob Holloway. How soon before we can proceed legally? Tom asked, accepting the cup of coffee Martha offered. Cooper leaned back in his chair, removing his spectacles. I've already dispatched a messenger to Judge Harrington. Given the seriousness of the allegations and the potential for violence, I've requested an emergency hearing this morning. Victor won't give up easily, Tom warned. He'll come looking here. I'm counting on it, Cooper replied with a grim smile. Sheriff Wilson of Prescott is a very different man from Deputy Tucker. He takes a dim view of men who beat their wives, legal right or not, and he's particularly interested in the allegations that Victor has been stealing from the company. It seems the sheriff invested some of his own savings in the Holloway mining ventures. A tentative hope began to form in Tom's mind. Perhaps the odds weren't quite as insurmountable as they had seemed. What happens now? Becky asked, her voice steady despite her evident fatigue. Now you rest, Cooper said kindly. All of you. I have a spare room upstairs where Mrs. Wilson and Mrs. Holloway can retire. Mr. Caldwell can use the couch in my office. When the judge sends word, we'll proceed to the courthouse. Tom shook his head. I'll stand watch. Victor could arrive at any time. The sheriff has posted deputies outside, Cooper assured him, and you'll be no good to anyone if you're too exhausted to think clearly when the time comes. Rest, Mr. Caldwell. The battle ahead requires a clear mind as much as a steady hand. Reluctantly, Tom acknowledged the wisdom in Cooper's words. He hadn't slept in nearly 24 hours, and the strain of the night's events weighed heavily on him. After Becky and Martha had gone upstairs, he stretched out on the leather couch, his revolver close at hand despite Cooper's assurances. Sleep claimed him almost immediately, a testament to his exhaustion. But even in sleep, his mind remained partly alert, listening for any sound that might signal danger. The sun was well above the horizon when Tom awoke to Cooper shaking his shoulder gently. Mr. Caldwell, the judge has sent word. The hearing will begin in 1 hour. Tom sat up, running a hand through his hair. Has there been any sign of Victor? Not yet, but it's only a matter of time. Cooper moved to his desk, gathering papers into a leather portfolio. The women are preparing upstairs. I suggest you make yourself presentable as well. Appearances matter in a courtroom. Tom nodded, aware that his clothes still bore the dust and sweat of the previous day's ordeal. Cooper directed him to a small washroom at the back of the office, where cold water and a relatively clean towel allowed him to remove the worst of the grime. The staircase creaked, and Tom looked up to see not the woman who had fled through the wilderness, but someone transformed. In the simple blue dress Martha had provided, with her hair properly arranged, Becky had the bearing of someone born to Boston society rather than a frontier survivor. Only her eyes, watchful and determined, revealed the hard journey that had brought her to this moment. You look, Tom began, then faltered, unable to find adequate words. Like a woman ready to face a judge, Martha supplied, following Becky down the stairs. And her husband. Cooper gathered them all with a glance. We should proceed to the courthouse. Judge Harrington appreciates punctuality. As they stepped outside, Tom noticed the increased activity on the street. Word of the emergency hearing had evidently spread, drawing curious onlookers. 2 deputies stood nearby, nodding respectfully to Cooper as the small group passed. The territorial courthouse stood at the end of the main street, a substantial building of local stone with wooden columns supporting a modest portico. As they approached, Tom spotted a familiar figure on the steps. Sheriff Wilson, his badge gleaming in the morning sun, his expression grave as he watched them approach. Cooper, the sheriff greeted them, his eyes moving assessingly over the group. Mrs. Wilson, Mrs. Holloway. His gaze settled on Tom. And Mr. Caldwell, I presume. Tom nodded, shaking the offered hand. Sheriff, thank you for your assistance. Don't thank me yet, Wilson replied grimly. Victor Holloway arrived in town 20 minutes ago with his father and their lawyer. They're already inside. Becky paled slightly, but her voice remained steady. I'm ready to face them. The sheriff nodded, a flicker of admiration crossing his weathered features. Judge Harrington is waiting. This way. The courtroom was small but formal, with wooden benches, a raised judge's platform, and the territorial flag hanging behind it. Despite the early hour, every bench was filled, the residents of Prescott drawn by the unusual spectacle of a prominent family facing public scrutiny. At a table on the left side of the room sat Victor, his face flushed with barely contained rage. Beside him was an older man with the same sharp features, but colder, more calculating eyes, Jacob Holloway. A third man in an expensive suit completed their party, presumably their lawyer. Sheriff Wilson led Tom, Becky, and Martha to a table on the right, where Cooper was already arranging his papers. As they seated themselves, Tom felt Victor's hate-filled gaze boring into him, but he refused to meet the man's eyes. Instead, he focused on Becky, noting the slight tremor in her hands despite her composed expression. "It will be all right," he murmured, close enough that only she could hear. Before she could respond, a side door opened, and Judge Harrington entered. The courtroom rose as one until the judge seated himself and gestured for everyone to be seated. "This is an emergency hearing in the matter of Rebecca Holloway," Harrington began without preamble. "I understand there are allegations of extreme cruelty and other serious matters. Mr. Cooper, as the petitioner's representative, you may begin." Cooper rose, his manner confident but respectful. "Thank you, Your Honor. I represent Mrs. Rebecca Holloway, who seeks dissolution of her marriage on grounds of extreme cruelty, abandonment with intent to cause harm, and moral unfitness of her husband." Victor's lawyer stood immediately. "Your Honor, these allegations are baseless. Mrs. Holloway abandoned her marital home voluntarily, and Mr. Holloway has simply been attempting to restore his rightful household. Any action taken by my client was within his legal rights as a husband." Judge Harrington held up a hand. "I'm aware of the legal position, Mr. Sullivan. However, the allegations warrant examination." He turned to Cooper. "Please present your evidence." For the next hour, Cooper methodically built his case. He first established the pattern of abuse, calling Martha to testify about the injuries she had observed over the years. Then he called Tom, who described finding Becky in the desert, the condition of her body, and Victor's subsequent threatening behavior. Throughout the testimony, Victor shifted restlessly in his seat, his face darkening with each new allegation. Jacob Holloway remained impassive, but Tom noticed his calculating gaze shifting between the judge, Cooper, and occasionally resting coldly on his son. Finally, Cooper called Becky herself to testify. She approached the front of the courtroom with measured steps, her head held high despite the whispers that followed her. After being sworn in, she faced the judge directly. "Mrs. Holloway," Cooper began gently, "please tell the court about your marriage to Victor Holloway." Becky's voice was soft but clear as she recounted the arranged marriage, the initial months of relative peace, and then the gradual descent into violence as Victor's business fortunes declined. She described the beatings, the threats, the psychological torment of never knowing what might trigger his rage. "And the incident that brought you to Mr. Caldwell's ranch?" Cooper prompted. "I was bitten by a rattlesnake while gathering herbs near our cabin," Becky explained. "When I returned seeking help, Victor accused me of bringing bad luck to him. He said the snake had marked me as cursed. He threw me out, told me not to return." Her voice faltered slightly. "He knew the venom was spreading. He knew what would happen if I didn't receive treatment." Cooper nodded sympathetically. "And after Mr. Caldwell found you and helped you recover, what happened?" "Victor came with armed men, demanding my return. When that failed, he returned with Deputy Tucker, attempting to use the law to force me back into his control." "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway." Cooper turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I would now like to introduce evidence regarding Mr. Holloway's moral character and business practices." Sullivan was on his feet immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. My client's business dealings have no bearing on this matrimonial matter." Judge Harrington considered briefly. "I'll allow it, Mr. Sullivan. The court needs to understand the full context of this situation." Cooper approached the judge's bench with Becky's journal. "Your Honor, this is Mrs. Holloway's personal journal, maintained over the 3 years of her marriage. It documents not only the abuse she suffered, but also contains detailed records of Mr. Victor Holloway's misappropriation of company assets, specifically the removal of unprocessed silver ore from the family mine to pay gambling debts and other personal expenses." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Jacob Holloway leaned forward, his expression hardening as he fixed his gaze on his son. As the journal was entered into evidence, Cooper continued, "The entries detail specific dates, amounts, and the names of individuals with whom Mr. Holloway conducted these unauthorized transactions. Several of these individuals are known gamblers and disreputable characters in the territory." Judge Harrington examined several pages of the journal, his expression grave. "Mr. Sullivan, does your client wish to respond to these allegations?" Sullivan conferred briefly with the Holloways before rising. "Your Honor, my client categorically denies these fabricated accusations. Mrs. Holloway clearly created this so-called journal recently as part of a vindictive attempt to damage her husband's reputation." "The journal contains entries dating back 3 years, Your Honor," Cooper countered. "The paper aging, ink fading, and consistency of handwriting all indicate it was maintained over time, not created recently." The judge nodded. I tend to agree, Mr. Sullivan. This appears to be a contemporaneous record. He turned to Victor directly. Mr. Holloway, these are serious allegations. Do you wish to testify under oath regarding these matters? Victor looked to his lawyer, who subtly shook his head. Not at this time, Your Honor, Victor muttered. Very well. Judge Harrington closed the journal and surveyed the courtroom. I've heard sufficient testimony to make a preliminary ruling. In the matter of the marriage of Rebecca and Victor Holloway, I find compelling evidence of extreme cruelty that exceeds what the law considers reasonable discipline. I therefore grant a temporary order of protection, prohibiting Mr. Holloway from approaching or communicating with Mrs. Holloway pending a final determination. Becky's shoulders sagged slightly with relief, but the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, the allegations of financial impropriety are sufficiently serious to warrant further investigation. I am ordering the territorial marshal to examine the business records of the Holloway Mining Company. He fixed Victor with a stern gaze. Mr. Holloway, you are to remain in Prescott until this investigation is complete. Violation of either order will result in your immediate arrest. Victor surged to his feet. This is outrageous. She's my wife. You can't... Sit down, Victor, Jacob Holloway ordered sharply, speaking for the first time. The command in his voice was unmistakable, and Victor subsided, though his face remained contorted with rage. The elder Holloway turned to the judge. Your Honor, my family accepts your ruling in this matter. We will cooperate fully with the investigation. His cold eyes shifted to his son, and I will personally ensure that Victor complies with the protection order. Judge Harrington nodded. See that you do, Mr. Holloway. This hearing is adjourned until next week, when we will review the findings of the investigation and consider final disposition of the marriage. As the judge rose and left the courtroom, a buzz of conversation erupted among the spectators. Tom moved immediately to Becky's side, offering his arm as she stepped away from the witness stand, her legs unsteady with the release of tension. You did it, he said softly. You stood your ground. Tears glistened in her eyes, but her smile was radiant. We did it. I couldn't have faced this alone. Cooper joined them, his expression satisfied. A good outcome, though only a first step. The investigation will likely uncover even more improprieties. Jacob Holloway won't risk his company's reputation for a son who has betrayed his trust. As they prepared to leave, Jacob Holloway approached, his manner coolly formal. Victor remained at the table, held there by Sullivan's restraining hand. Mrs. Holloway, Jacob began, inclining his head slightly, it seems I have misjudged the situation. Had I known the full extent of my son's behavior, I would have intervened sooner. Becky regarded him warily. Your son made his own choices, Mr. Holloway. Indeed. Jacob's gaze shifted to Tom. Mr. Caldwell, I believe there has been a misunderstanding regarding your ranch as well. My interest in water rights for the mining operations led to some overzealous actions by my representatives. I assure you I have no desire to pressure you regarding your property. Tom met the older man's calculating gaze steadily. I appreciate the clarification, Mr. Holloway. Jacob nodded once, understanding that his attempted olive branch had been acknowledged but not necessarily accepted. Good day to you all. With that, he returned to his son, his posture rigid with barely contained anger. Outside the courthouse, the morning sun had burned away the lingering coolness, promising another scorching Arizona day. Sheriff Wilson approached as they descended the steps. That was well done, he said, addressing Becky directly. Not many would have the courage to stand up to the Holloways in open court. Thank you, Sheriff, she replied. Will the protection order truly keep Victor away? Wilson nodded. It will. Jacob Holloway won't risk further scandal, especially with the business investigation pending, and my deputies will ensure Victor behaves himself while in Prescott. He tipped his hat. Safe travels back to Skull Creek when you're ready. As the sheriff departed, Cooper turned to the small group. I suggest we remain in Prescott until tomorrow. The Holloway temper is legendary, and despite the sheriff's assurances, it would be prudent to allow some time for the situation to cool. Martha nodded agreement. I have a friend who runs a boarding house near the edge of town. She'll have rooms for us. Tom glanced at Becky, noting the exhaustion still evident beneath her composure. A day of rest would be wise, he agreed. It's been a long road to get here. The boarding house proved to be a modest but clean establishment run by a cheerful widow named Mrs. Peterson, who welcomed Martha with open arms and settled them into comfortable rooms without excessive curiosity. After a simple but satisfying lunch, Martha announced her intention to visit friends in town, leaving Tom and Becky alone in the small parlor. For a moment, silence stretched between them, both acutely aware of the shift in circumstances. The immediate danger had passed, the urgent purpose that had united them temporarily resolved. "What will you do now?" Tom asked finally, voicing the question that had been circling in his mind. Becky gazed out the window at the unfamiliar street. "I'm not entirely sure. The judge granted temporary protection, but the divorce isn't final. And even when it is," she trailed off, her future suddenly vast and undefined. "You could return to Boston," Tom suggested, though the words felt like stones in his mouth. "Start fresh where no one knows your history." Becky turned to look at him, something unreadable in her expression. "Is that what you think I should do?" Tom hesitated, torn between honesty and what he perceived as her best interest. "I think you should go wherever offers you the best chance at happiness." "And where do you think that might be?" The directness of her gaze made evasion impossible. "Becky, I can't presume to know what would make you happy." "Can't you?" she asked softly. "You've shown me more kindness in these past weeks than I've known in years. You've treated me as an equal, taught me to defend myself, given me shelter when I had nowhere else to turn." She took a step closer. "If I were to say that I've found more happiness at your ranch than I ever expected to find again, what would you say to that?" Tom's heart hammered in his chest. "I'd say that you've been through a terrible ordeal, and gratitude can sometimes feel like something else." A small smile touched her lips. "Is that what you think this is? Gratitude?" "I'm 20 years your senior," Tom said, giving voice to one of his many doubts. "You deserve someone young, someone who can offer you a future, not just a hardscrabble existence on an aging ranch." "I think I've had enough of other people deciding what I deserve," Becky replied, a hint of steel entering her voice. "I've earned the right to choose for myself." Her expression softened. "But perhaps you are not interested in having me remain at the ranch. If that's the case, I understand completely." Tom shook his head immediately. "That's not it at all. I just don't want you to feel obligated or—" "Thomas Caldwell," Becky interrupted gently, "are you going to stand there telling me all the reasons I shouldn't care for you? Or are you going to admit that you might care for me too?" The directness of the question caught him off guard. For a moment he stood frozen, years of self-sufficiency and emotional reserve warring with the undeniable truth. "I do care for you," he admitted finally, "more than I thought possible after Sarah. But I never expected, never hoped." "I know," she said simply. "Neither did I. Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it?" Tom found himself moving toward her, drawn by a force beyond conscious thought. "What about Sarah?" he asked, the last barrier between them. "I loved her deeply. Part of me always will." "As it should be," Becky replied. "I would never ask you to forget her. She's part of who you are, part of what made you the man standing before me now." She reached out, her fingers brushing his weathered hand. "We all carry our past with us, Tom. The question is whether we're willing to carry them together into the future." In that moment, Tom saw with perfect clarity what he had been too cautious, too bound by propriety to acknowledge. This remarkable woman who had endured so much and emerged stronger was offering him not just companionship, but understanding. A chance to honor Sarah's memory while embracing a new beginning. He took her hand in his, the gesture saying what words could not. The journey back to Skull Creek the following day seemed shorter somehow, the landscape no less harsh, but somehow more welcoming. Martha rode ahead in her wagon, providing a discreet distance that allowed Tom and Becky to talk freely as they rode side by side. They spoke of practical matters, the work needed on the ranch, the upcoming harvest, the legal proceedings still to come. But beneath the everyday conversation ran a current of shared understanding, of possibilities stretching before them like the open road. As they crested the final ridge overlooking the Caldwell Ranch, Tom reined in his horse. The afternoon sun bathed the buildings in golden light, transforming the modest structures into something almost majestic against the backdrop of distant mountains. "It's not much," Tom said, suddenly seeing his home through new eyes, "but it's solid, built to last." Becky smiled, understanding the words beneath the words. "Like its owner," she replied softly. They rode down the slope together, toward the ranch that would become their shared future once the last legal hurdles were cleared. Neither knew exactly what challenges lay ahead, but both carried the quiet confidence of those who had already weathered the worst storms life could offer. Behind them, the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting their shadows far ahead of them on the dusty road. Two shadows riding side by side toward home. The rocking chair creaked gently as old Thomas Caldwell finished his tale, the evening light fading to purple dusk around the porch. His grandson stared up at him, eyes wide with wonder. "So that's how you and Grandma Becky met?" the boy asked. "She really shot at those men with a tiny pistol?" Tom chuckled, his aged hand finding the weathered gold band on his finger, turning it thoughtfully as he had done countless times over the 30 years of their marriage. "She did. Your grandmother was the bravest person I ever knew." "And did the bad man, Victor, did he ever come back?" Tom's face grew serious. "No, son. The investigation uncovered even more wrongdoing than we'd suspected. Jacob Holloway sent Victor east to avoid further scandal, and we never saw him again." He looked out over what was now the thriving town of Caldwell Springs, named in honor of the watershed that had sustained the community through decades of growth. Sometimes justice finds its way, even in the hardest places. The boy considered this, his young mind working through the moral of the story. "Grandpa, do you still miss Grandma Sarah sometimes, even though you love Grandma Becky?" The question, asked with a child's innocent directness, brought a soft smile to Tom's lined face. "Yes, I do. Your Grandma Becky understood that. She used to say that hearts are like houses. They have many rooms, and loving someone new doesn't mean you have to empty the rooms where old loves lived." Judge Harrington granted the final divorce decree 6 months after the hearing. Victor, disowned by his father, disappeared back east, rumors placing him in New York gambling houses and later New Orleans taverns. That Christmas, when the desert briefly bloomed after rare winter rains, Tom and Becky married in a simple ceremony at the Skull Creek Church. Martha Wilson stood as witness, along with Cooper and Sheriff Wilson, who'd ridden all the way from Prescott. "I never thought I'd stand here again," Tom had whispered as they exchanged vows beneath the same roof where he'd said goodbye to Sarah. Becky had squeezed his hand, understanding perfectly. "We both carry our past with us," she'd replied, "but today we start walking the same path." And that path had led through 30 years, 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and the transformation of a lonely ranch into the heart of a thriving community. A woman's voice called from inside the house. Tom's daughter, the boy's mother, announcing dinner. As the child scampered inside, Tom remained on the porch a moment longer, his gaze rising to the first evening star appearing in the darkening sky. "Thank you both," he whispered to the women who had shaped his life. One taken too soon, one found against all odds on a desperate day in Skull Valley. For a moment, he could almost feel them beside him, Sarah's gentle wisdom and Becky's fierce determination, the two halves that had made his life complete. Then he rose stiffly and made his way inside, following the warm light and voices of his family. The greatest legacy 2 remarkable women had helped him build on this harsh but beautiful frontier. Behind him, the door closed on the gathering night, as the stars emerged one by one over the valley that had witnessed so much pain and healing, loss and love, endings that became unexpected beginnings on the long road home.